Shelly Miscavige. She has not appeared in public since 2005.
Where's Shelley and what happened?
Where is Shelley?
We're looking at like 17 years of a person just missing.
Shelly Miscavige was given into the sole care of L. Ron Hubbard by her parents when she was 12.
This is where Shelley is believed to be being held captive.
Do you believe that Shelly Miscavige is a threat today?
Oh,
Absolutely.
she's seen it all. She's been by his side the whole time.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host for today, Claire Headley, and this is the next episode in my series, Where is Shelly Miscavige?, in which we have been deep diving and talking with all different kinds of people who know Shelley personally, worked with her on various different levels. And really, we are just continuing to shine a light on the fact that the leader of Scientology, David Miscavige, has hidden his wife away for 18 years now. So my guest for today is a very dear friend, Karen Schless Pressley, author of Escaping Scientology. Welcome to the channel, Karen. It's great to have you here.
Claire, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to doing this with you for a long time.
Yes, likewise. I know life tends to get in the way, but I just so appreciate you taking this time, and I'm excited for our conversation today. I think it will be a very different take on some of the questions that we've been discussing. But so to start off with, I thought it might be helpful for you to just give a summary of the years that you spent in Scientology, and then we can talk about how our paths crossed. And of course, we'll talk about your incredible book, and I will link to your book in the description. So those listening who maybe haven't heard of or listened to or read your book can get a copy of that.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's see. I got into Scientology in the very early 1980s in LA with my then husband, Peter Schless. He got me into Scientology while we were in LA, and we started out at the Valley Org around 1981 after starting with a field auditor. Then we went to the Valley Org. Then we went from the Valley Org to Celebrity Center in Hollywood. So by the time we landed in CC, it was around 1982. And because I was a designer, a clothes designer at the time, and Peter was a musician and composer. And I had started a music publishing company to publish his music. We had a recording studio in LA at the time, up in Coldwater Canyon. And when we got to the Celebrity Center, we were really treated like anybody who succeeds in any way in their career. By Celebrity Center, we were treated very special. And so we moved over there from Valley Org. So that was about 1982, right after our hit song came out, On the Wings of Love. That was our big claim to fame at the time.
Beautiful song to this day.
to this day, we're receiving royalties on that song. So I'm really thankful for it.
Yes.
But thank you.
Yes.
So we were at CC when LRH died in 86. And right around that time, I signed a Sea Org contract, but Peter did not want to join the Sea Org. But he had started going up to Golden Era Productions, to work on the Road to Freedom album.
Okay.
And while he was going back and forth to Gold, coming back home, I had already routed into the Sea Org at that point.
Oh, wow.
And I routed into the Sea Org around 87, I think it was. And when Peter was going up to Gold is when David Miscavige invited him to join the Sea Org. Very interesting, because prior to that, Peter did not want to join the Sea Org. He wanted to remain a musician and composer in our business.
Yeah.
But Dave Miscavige lured him, essentially. Very interesting, because Peter had taken LSD, which made him unqualified for the Sea Org. But Dave said, well, because of your production record professionally, I am going to waive that disqualification. So Peter ended up at Gold. We were both on clearance lines, but he ended up going up to Gold sooner than me because he was in the middle of this album recording.
Wow.
So yeah.
And because of his personal invitation from David Miscavige, and David Miscavige is saying, that's all right. I know Hubbard said you can't be in the Sea Org because of LSD. We got you covered.
Exactly. and that is a really significant point, Claire, because that was the first time, actually, my first experience with David Miscavige on the fact that he would waive or ignore or violate or distort LRH policy anytime he felt like it.
Yep.
And that was my introduction to realizing that, from my perspective at that time, because I was a tried and true Scientologist, I really believed, I was in all the way. Obviously, I joined the Sea Org, but I believed in LRH policy, the tech at the time. And so I thought Dave Miscavige was a squirrel, but I had to keep that privately to myself, even when I was on clearance lines, which was very difficult to, you think of other things, when you're being asked questions that could dig up that thought, but you know what I'm saying? So,
yeah.
So I get
just to add a comment, as it's funny to me, having talked to so many people, that even though you were new coming, you're coming in, you're on clearance lines, you're newly in the Sea Org, you obviously knew, definitely don't mention your bad thought about David Miscavige.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, on the life history sec check that you do on clearance lines, you find ways of, overriding certain thoughts.
Yep.
And anyway, so that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
So I landed up at the INT base. I think it was like late '89. So between that time, I was the CEO of the CC network.
Okay.
And that was a really challenging post for me.
And so you were essentially, if I understand correctly, the head executive over all the external celebrity centers.
Yes.
Not the one in Hollywood, but the network. So like Nashville and wherever else.
Yeah.
I think there was one in Portland.
Yeah, there were 13 at the time when I was there, but it was different from when Yvonne Gentz was the CEO of the CC of LA, because she was the whole thing. Yeah. But by the time I landed on that post, like you said, there were many other CCs. So I was over the entire network. And internally, we had a president that actually took care of the celebrities. And we had a captain that was like the internal ED. So there were three of us. I was over the whole network, and then the captain and the president. But I would get pulled into some internal things. And I met David Miscavige in 1987, actually, which was right around the Road to Freedom album, when Peter won the IAS Freedom Medal Award, and the IAS flew him to Paris for the event, and I got to go as well. Of course. Well,
somehow I didn't remember this part of the history, that Peter Schless was awarded a Freedom Medal.
Yeah, 1987. Huh. I think it was the second year. Andrique Shapers, I think, was year one.
Okay.
I think Peter and Andrique got it in 87.
Okay.
So we went to the IS event. They put us up at this beautiful hotel in Paris, and we went to the event, which was held in the Eiffel Tower. And I find that whole history so fascinating, because in my examples of Scientology, I did not see Scientology orgs living a lifestyle that could be, I'm trying to say, the way the executives threw the party at the Eiffel Tower in Paris was way beyond the like economic level that I saw orgs operating at. Let's put it that way.
Yep.
Because Valley Org was very run down at that time. And even when Peter and I got to CC, it was not in great shape and it needed a complete overhaul renovation.
Yes.
But anyway, I met Dave Miscavige at the IAS event, and he was there with Guillaume Lesève, the ED Int, and Mark Yeager, who was COCMO Int. And Mark Yeager and David Miscavige never said a word to me the whole time I was there, but Guillaume introduced himself, and he was warm and friendly and shook my hand and asked about my life and things like that. So that was another very interesting introduction to David Miscavige.
Yep. And I agree with your assessment just at face value, by the way, too, in relation to David Miscavige, Mark Yeager, and Guillaume. Guillaume was always so much more personable and just so much more engaged than either David Miscavige or Mark Yeager were.
I so agree with you. And I always thought that Guillaume, when I saw him in videos and things like that, when I met him in person, he was, like you said, so warm and engaging. And to me, he was a really good example of a Scientologist executive. Whereas David Miscavige and Mark Yeager, who was always in Dave's shadow, always sort of loomed over him, but never said anything. And then Dave was just aloof and arrogant and detached and, cold eyes. And anyway, very interesting, though, the history, because Guillaume Lesève ultimately became my senior when I was in the Sea Org later at the Int base. And that was very interesting for me historically, how my timeline went in Scientology. But so I get up to the Int base, it's like late 89, and the Road to Freedom album is done. And Peter had already started morphing into becoming a gold musician, and Ron Miscavige, when I was still at CC, Ron Miscavige used to come down to try to basically grease the line for me to come up to gold, because I questioned whether I wanted to ever leave CC, because I was very happy at CC. But he said, I'll work it out for you to become the music manager. So that's the post I thought I was going to get when I got to the Int base. Lo and behold.
Wait, let me guess. There was a bait and switch?
No, not bait and switch. Exactly.
It's like in every single Sea Org member's history I've ever talked to, including my own.
Exactly. So you're very, you know what we're talking about here. And so I ended up working in Cine, and Mark Fisher posted me there. He was COB's I don't remember his post.
The liaison office. Yes.
So he posted me in Cine, and that was a nightmare for me. And I prefer to skip over that part of the story.
Sure. You got it.
Because I write about it extensively in my book.
Yeah.
Working in Cine for me was a complete and total nightmare, largely because of the way Dave treated everybody in Cine.
Yep.
And I actually told Peter I couldn't tolerate being at the Int base and working in Cine. And I blew the first time in 1990. I thought it was a complete and total madhouse. And I saw, I'll talk about just a few things. Sleep deprivation. Yeah. Sleep deprivation made everyone crazy. Physical abuse, psychological abuse, deprivation of benefits, people sleeping under desks, being constantly badmouthed by Dave for not being able to do our jobs, which I think is all very interesting. Also, I just want to make the point that Dave, his background is he was a cameraman under LRH. And it was Dave who shot all those crappy, horrible films that Cine had to completely redo. So here's Dave the cameraman responsible for a lot of the crap that Scientology published in films. And here we were trying to reshoot these things. And he making mincemeat out of us on a daily basis. Constant invalidation. You know the story. So I escaped the first time in 1990. And I came back. I was gone for about 2 weeks. And I came back because I didn't want to leave my husband. Yeah. I just wanted out of the Sea Org. I wanted off the int base. And Peter did not want to leave. So I came back for that reason only. I stuck it out 3 more years, and I escaped the second time in 1993. When I came back the second time, Peter and I was hoping that Peter would leave with me, and he didn't. And I came back in 1993. So I toughed it out for 5 more years. And it was during those 5 years when I had my most encounters with Shelly Miscavige. I really didn't know her at the beginning of when I first arrived at the base. I only ever saw Dave in Cine, other than a few times when she would, he would always bring an entourage, and you're very familiar with his entourage.
Yes.
Wherever he went on the base, he would bring an entire entourage of his COB assistant, COB communicator, 1 or 2 other messengers taking notes, an ethics officer or a security guard, just a whole schlep of people.
Yeah. And inevitably at least 2 or 3 of the bulldog types, like the male, tall, going to be able to deal with anything should any situation arise, which, yeah.
Exactly. So true. So during those 5 years, I had different encounters with Shelley. And so I think that my background of what led up to meeting her really kind of shaped my ultimate opinion, not only about her, but about her relationship with David Miscavige as the leaders of Scientology. And it was their relationship. I cover this in my book somewhat, but I wish I would have dwelled on it a little bit more. It was their relationship that made it very clear to me that, number 1, Dave is an SP. Mm-hmm. Number 2, that Scientology was a complete and total fraud and sham. And number 3, that the int base was certainly not a place that was going to clearing the planet.
Right.
It all fell apart for me pretty clearly. But the big thing that drove all this was me feeling all this time that Dave Miscavige is an SP.
Yeah.
So I always looked around at people thinking, doesn't anybody else see this? Like, I had done the PTSSP course at CC, and I don't think the int base at that time had been made yet to do the PTSSP course. And, not that I believed Scientology, not in retrospect, I didn't believe that Scientology worked, but at the time, that was my frame of reference for trying to figure out, who is David Miscavige? Why does he behave this way?
Right.
And COB Assistant is number 2 to him. Why does she tolerate what she did? Why did she behave the way she did? So for that reason, this talk with you, I wanted to cover a couple of things. And over those 5 years when I really got to know Shelley, I want to talk a little bit about and tell some stories about her, who I believed her to be as COB Assistant. And then I want to talk about Shelley as my personal advocate, because she became that. And I want to talk about Shelley as her own person. Awesome. So
sounds good to me. I'm on board with that, with all of that.
Okay, great. So I'm not going to separate each topic. It's just that my stories are going to interchange between who is she a COB assistant, and who is she as her own person? And can that ever be separated? My conclusion is no, it can't. And who was she as my advocate? And how could she be my advocate when she was COB assistant? So there's a lot of dichotomy in there. So I want to,
as there typically is in anything related to Scientology.
Exactly. So I want to talk about Shelley's role, what I learned about her as COB assistant, because I saw her in many different settings that were extremely traumatic for me. And this is why I want to talk about it, because I think that it could give a little insight into some people who weren't there, who didn't see these particular events happen. So first of all, I want to bring up a quote that is in my book that I refer to. At the time that I wrote this book, which was around 2017, I was watching a TV show on Netflix called House of Cards. Did you ever watch that? House of Cards?
I watched a little bit of it here and there. Mark watched the whole thing, I think. But,
God, I was obsessed with that show. And I love the role that Robin Wright played as the president's wife and who she was on her own. She was the president's wife, but she was very much her own person. And one of the things that she once talked about, she had kind of a solo, like a cameo shot, where she talks about how, as being in the White House and her role as wife of president is, I'm reading from a note here, we rationalize the obscene into the palatable.
There you go. That's a good one.
When I heard her say that in that show, and there were so many parallels between House of Cards and the Int base, like so many. That's one of the things I loved about the show. I felt that it revealed so much to me about life at the Int base. But rationalize the obscene into the palatable. This is what I believe Shelley's role was as COB assistant.
Yeah.
And I'll explain to you why I feel that way. I really got to know her the best when I was the International Management Public Relations Officer, which is short for which is IMPR, when I was the IMPR. This was in the mid-90s. And my office was in Del Sol, which was the building that housed the exec strata with ED-INT and all the exec ints. And on the second floor was CMO Int.
Yep.
Okay, so you remember this building, the old white stucco building with the long hallway from the front door to the back door and the red carpet that went down the hall.
Yep, and the creepy floorboards, floorboards underneath.
Exactly. And when anybody came in, especially COB and his entourage, you would hear this pounding of footsteps down that wooden hallway. And that sound, it took me so long to get that sound out of my mind. But COB used to come in because Ray Midoff at the time was senior CSN. His office was right across the hall from mine when I was IMPR. Next to Ray Midoff's office was ED-INT's office, Guillaume's office. And next to my office were the different exec ints. They all shared offices. Like Diana Hubbard was right next to me. She was Div 6 internal exec int at the time. Sherry Murphy was Fields exec int, and on down the rows. Yep. So we could hear each other's conversations and things like that. And if anybody was screaming at each other, we could all hear it. Okay. So COB comes pounding down that floor with his entourage. And he, of course, you know, we're all thinking, oh God, is he coming after me? Or who's he coming after this time? Well, on one particular occasion, actually two particular occasions, he goes to see Ray Midoff. And of course, this is the worst that I've seen Dave treat anyone, is how I saw him treat Ray. Yep. And he would drag, or he would get his ethics MA or whoever, his people, to drag him out in the hallway. Now, Ray was, what do you say, about maybe 6 feet tall or so, 6'2".
Yep.
And Dave is about 5'2" or 5'4", somewhere around there.
David Miscavige always would call him Gumby because he was a beanpole.
Gumby, exactly. Beanpole. I forgot about that. So he pushes Ray up against the wall. This is a 5'2" guy pushing pushing Gumby up against the wall.
Yep.
And reaching up and grabbing him by his tie and pushing that tie up into his throat so his head goes like this against the wall, using the foulest language. When are you going to get those fucking rundowns done? And he was talking about the Knots rundowns. He would go on and on about how LRH left it up to Ray Midoff to finish writing the Knots rundowns, or whatever was to come after Knots.
Right. And of course, Knots, for anyone listening, is the OT level 5. So, you know, of the upper levels, it starts obviously at 1, and this was number 5. And currently there's up to number 8, and there's supposed to be up to number 15, which is a complete farce. Let's just call a spade a spade.
Of course. So I wrote about this in my book. I describe it in quite detail. And he's screaming. And meanwhile, Ray's turning red and purple with his neck being choked and his tie being pushed up in his throat. And Dave was utterly merciless. And, you know, I heard this screaming out in the hallway, and I heard all this ruckus because I'm right outside Ray's door. So I go out there to see what the fuck is happening. And there's a small crowd gathered now around. So COB Assistant, and COB's entourage, and then other people standing around. You know, other people would pile on so that if they had the opportunity to act like they were going to try to, you know, help COB or support him in some way or put somebody's ethics in, you know what it's like. So I saw this, but as I saw this going on, I looked over at Shelley because, you know, up to that point, I had had other experiences with her that I haven't mentioned yet, where I feel like I always connected with Shelley's humanity.
Yep.
I never connected with Dave's humanity, and I searched for his humanity. I was at the INT base for 9 years, and I searched for his humanity, never connected with it, whereas Shelley, I had. So I'm standing here watching Ray being physically assaulted by Dave, and nobody's doing anything to get Dave to back down. And the only person who could have done that really was Shelley.
Right.
And I looked over at her and I thought, why aren't you doing anything? You know, and I tried to read her nonverbals, and her nonverbals on her face showed absolutely no sign. She looked stoic. And of course, you know, you were in RTC, you know, the motif or the theme of RTC is cold as hard as cold chrome steel.
Which, by the way, do you know that that's one word different than a direct quote from Adolf Hitler to Nazi youth?
No, what was it?
Hard as cold Krupp steel. It's a direct quote from an Adolf Hitler speech to Nazi youth.
Wow. Why am I not surprised?
Right?
Claire, I'm so glad you brought that up, because later on, in later years, it was like 97, early 98, Shelley had given me a project to redesign the RTC uniforms. And when I was researching the RTC logo, you know, it was this rectangle with all these lightning bolts coming out of it. I found something. I found an old image. I found it, an old image that was connected to the Nazi party. But I'm sorry, it's not in my memory right now what that connection was. But I found it because we had a program at the INT base called SIR, where, do you remember Sue, who used to load all the LRH advices into SIR? Wasn't her name Sue? She was in
Sue Walker.
Yes, it was Sue Walker.
Yep.
She loaded all the advices into SIR. And whenever I needed to research anything for uniform research is how I posed it. I would ask her for, what did LRH say about, right? And I would give her keywords and she would find things for me. And that's how I found this.
Interesting.
A reference that LRH wrote, and then I took that reference and tagged it to something else that I found. But it had to do with the Nazi Party. And
wow.
I'm really amazed by that. And as a side topic, which I don't want to get off on a tangent, but Mitch Brisker did a really great interview with Chris Shelton about a month ago, where Mitch shared some realizations that he had while he was at the IMP base reading the LRH advices about what did LRH say about filmmaking.
Yeah.
And in there, Mitch mentions that there was a Nazi propagandist named Lenny, can't think of her last name, I have it in my notes, but LRH loved her work in the Nazi propaganda films. She was the Nazi propagandist. And Mitch said that a penny dropped for him when he was researching this, because he was up there working as the director to reshoot all the films in Cine. And so he was made to study the LRH advices on filmmaking. And this is when he ran into this.
Wow.
And the penny drop for him is like, oh, I'm a director. I'm making propaganda films for Scientology that really stems from LRH's admiration of this Nazi propagandist. She used big staging, huge flags, big columns, and everything else like that. And when I heard,
like everything else Scientology does in their events to this day.
You got it. Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly the thing. And when I heard Mitch say that the penny dropped for him when he was studying this, it also just was another puzzle piece that completed the picture for me, because while I was IMPR, I was over the events unit, and, Cindy Rayner, cruising, and she was the main events designer. And at that time, there was a time when I was her deputy, and we used to do the drawings and have submit them to COB for approval. And if they weren't big enough or ostentatious enough or grandiose enough, they would get disapproved and we'd have to fix it. So he was always on this bent of like the biggest, the most grandiose. And that's where all that comes from. It comes from the Nazi propaganda influence of L. Ron Hubbard and David Miscavige. Isn't that interesting? That neither Mitch nor I realized it until we got out.
Yeah. And meanwhile, now we're comparing notes, and I was struggling with trying to be hard as cold chrome steel in Religious Technology Center. Come to find out, that's, my struggle was completely understandable because it was patterned off of Adolf Hitler Nazi youth speech. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. And, had you or I had access to any internet when we were in the Sea Org at the INT base, think of what we could have discovered if we could have only gained the knowledge. But because, our communications were so controlled, we never had the opportunity to learn such things.
That's right.
Okay.
We were completely cloistered and shut off from the fruits of observation. That's an inside joke between you and me, because it's in a Hubbard policy, like, these people are shut off from the fruits of observation. Oh yeah, no, he's talking about the outside world being inadequate, and yet here we were completely fitting that description.
Exactly. And what you're saying right there totally ties to my observation of Shelley as well, because just, as COB assistant, she had been tied off or cut off from the fruits of observation since she was a kid when she was on the Apollo as a messenger.
Yeah. And frankly, even before that, actually, as I've come to learn more during this series, her family dove deep into Scientology when I think she was 6 years old. Like she was in the cadet organization in Mexico when she was between I think around 8 or 9 years old.
Okay.
Yeah.
I missed that. I guess I hadn't seen that podcast, but I knew of her being a messenger because whenever I was with her, she would sit down and she would reminisce about being a messenger. So back to the story about her with hard as cold chrome steel facial expression, while her husband, Dave, was physically assaulting a senior, anyone, doesn't matter what his post was, but he was senior CSN, in front of at least 12 people. Right. And none of us did anything to stop him. Very interesting how all of us contributed to the obstruction of justice. We stood by and let it happen as if our hands were tied, which they were not. But Shelley is the one person who could have stopped it and didn't. And that made me question who she was as her own person, because as her own person, evidently, she let her role as COB assistant override any like personal values or conscience that she may have had. But then when you get down to it, what could have been those values? Because you're saying she was a messenger in the CMO when she was in Mexico at age 6?
8.
Like that?
8, yeah.
And
I mean, she and her sisters ended up in an orphanage in Texas because her parents left them for a weekend alone because of Scientology. You know, I'm just saying the traumatic events of Shelley's childhood completely aligned to me when I started doing all this digging in as to who Shelley is and why she is so completely cowed and just destroyed as a person through the years. And not that she hasn't done certain things along the way to contribute to that, but ultimately she is a victim of Scientology.
Very much so. Very much so. There's a quote that I pulled, which is in my book as well. And it refers to all of us who were in the Sea Org, all of us who were Scientologists, but I'm bringing it up right now as regards Shelley, a COB assistant. And the quote says, someone once said, "If you are afraid to speak out against tyranny, then you are a slave of it."
Wow. And
I read that quote after I got out and I was writing my book, and I read books extensively from everything from philosophy and psychology to political science to books about slavery, you name it, all those sorts of topics. And I found so many quotes that gave me insight into what I saw happen in the Sea Org. If you're afraid to speak out against tyranny, then you are a slave of it. And so I have to say that in all my experiences with Shelley, and I'm going to tell a few more stories, I concluded that Shelley was a slave to Dave. And she was probably a slave to LRH as well. Yeah. But definitely to Dave. Because for her to stand by and watch her husband assault someone, you could be nothing but a slave to the assaulter.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
Person committing it. So she wasn't allowed to be her own person to that extent. She was not allowed to be her own person.
Yeah.
So another example that I wanted to give, again, when I was IMPR, aside from Cine, working in Cine, being the IMPR was the worst time of my existence.
Yeah, I can understand. That was one of the top hot seat posts on that property because you were responsible for putting on all of the events. And I'd say that's was on the top 10 posts that interacted very closely with David Miscavige.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Hell in a handbasket right there.
That post is what made me require PTSD counseling later when I got out of the Sea Org. That post.
That does not surprise me one bit. And I'm really glad you did that.
Thank you. Yeah, the PTSD counseling really helped me a lot. It stopped the nightmares. But back to my story.
Yeah.
So one time, I'm going to finish the Ray Madoff thing. So after Ray came down off the wall and he recovered his breath, you know, COB just verbally lacerated him, and everybody stood there and let it happen. And then he was made to get on his hands and knees and crawl into his office. And he had a bathroom right by his door. And he had to crawl on all fours to the office, to the bathroom, where COB said, "This is where you're going to spend your days, cleaning the floor with a toothbrush." So COB specialized in humiliation.
Completely.
And of course, everybody let him do it. Nobody did anything, myself included. Okay, so another story. So you remember the way RTC was laid out? It had the lower villas and the upper villas.
Yep. There were three villas. The lower villa was where David and Shelley lived.
Okay.
And the middle villa was the main offices of the staff of Religious Technology Center. And the upper villa, prior to the building 50, the RTC building being built, those were Dave and Shelley's offices.
Okay. So it was the upper villa where I used to get called the most.
Yes.
Okay.
You would run up past come down to the lower villa, go up to the middle villa, and then they had the little stairs that led up to, and there was a patio out front with some umbrellas, and then so that was the upper villa.
And there was a driveway, right, that went along the back.
Yes.
I used to ride I went out and bought a scooter so I wouldn't have to keep running up to the villas. Every time we would be called by Dave, "Get up to the upper villa right now," or someone would call us. But there was a time when I was summoned. I was in Del Sol at the moment, and Guillaume Edient came into the office and said, "COB wants to see us in the upper villa right now." So when that happens, you drop what you're doing, you turn around and go, and you run if you don't have a motorcycle.
Yep.
So I used to go on Guillaume's motorcycle until I got my own scooter. But Guillaume, then Ray Madoff, CO Mark Yeager, and CO Gold, who at the time was Wendell Reynolds.
Okay.
So all five of us were waiting. We were in the war room. Remember the war room?
Yes.
That had the big map on the wall, and there was this big glass table with a telephone in the middle and a workstation on the side, if I remember correctly. We were all made to wait. We were standing in line like this, and Dave, we're standing there like wooden soldiers, in fear, what was going to happen now.
Yep.
So Dave starts screaming at the top, and Shelley was in the room, but she was in the background. So Dave starts screaming at Guillaume first and Wendell, the CO Gold, saying, "Why isn't this fucking slideshow done that I ordered you to do 2 weeks ago? Where is it?" And Guillaume didn't know anything about it. And Wendell, of course, took the rap, because who was supposed to do the slideshow but the Cine crew? At the time, that's who was supposed to do it.
Okay.
So he told Guillaume, he pushed Guillaume in the chest, and Guillaume fell backwards, stepped. And he did the same thing to Wendell, and then to Mark Yeager. He, the verbal lacerations, "You're an SP, you're stopping Scientology, you don't make sure that anything gets done, you can't do anything." And he said, Karen, where is the slideshow? And I said, sir, I'm so sorry. I don't know anything about the slideshow. If it's my hat, I'll grab my hat and I will find out about it and I will get it done. And he blamed Guillaume. He said, you're her senior. Why didn't you tell her the slideshow needs to get done? Well, I'm like simplifying what happened here.
Right. No, I understand.
This was a major screaming match.
Yeah.
And with people being pushed, falling, losing their balance, and Shelley's in the background. So COB turned on his heels and went over to this work table where there were a box of slides. And evidently, those were the slides for the slideshow that had to be done. Well, why were they in COB's workroom instead of where they needed to be, like for editing or wherever? Right. I didn't know anything about the damn thing. So I summoned up the courage where these 4 execs were standing there. I went over and walked over to where COB was at the work table and said, sir, are these the slides that you're referring to? If you would, please let me have them and I'll find out what the order is and I will get this done. And he looked at me like shocked that I had the gall to get into his space and communicate with him.
Yep.
And he said, Shelley, and he looked at me and he turned and he said, Shelley, go get the dispatch that ordered this project to get done and give it to Karen. Evidently, she's the only one that will get anything done. So I waited and the other 4 execs left. So Shelley came and they had all gone and she handed me the dispatch and she didn't say anything, but her face, her nonverbal said, here it is. And her tone told me, it's okay. You'll get through this. Not a big deal.
Yep.
And that moment was the first moment that I had with her. And I had many after that. But I'm bringing this up as an example of how COB Assistant, Shelley as COB Assistant, would at times try to be her own person, let her, she had traits of kindness, patience, and even compassion.
I completely agree.
And none of those traits aligned with hard as cold chrome steel. But she could see the difference between justice and injustice.
Yeah.
Even when it was being committed by Dave. And, you know, when she gave that to me and she said that to me in that tone, I suddenly felt safe in her presence, like she was my protector. Or this is when I began to think of her as my advocate. And I just completely changed my thoughts about her. It's like, okay, she's trying to let herself be her own person. She really does have personal values. Yeah. But she wouldn't let Dave see this.
Right.
She did it outside of his vision. So I'm like, wow, she's a slave, but she's not totally gone.
Yeah.
She's still very human and compassionate. She couldn't let on much. And she, you know, didn't let me slide, but she just set a tone that let me know it was okay. I was going to make it.
Yeah. And did you also feel that she was communicating by her tone that she didn't agree with David Miscavige's physical and verbal abuse and violence, or was it not that much?
I felt that her tone showed me that she disagreed with him. Yeah. I absolutely felt that. Because otherwise, I mean, kindness, compassion, and patience is not something that she could display in front of Dave when he was being his usual abusive, ruthless, violent self.
Right.
So,
completely.
yes. Yeah. So to that degree, she had to hide it. which again reinforces the whole point that she is a slave to his tyranny.
Right.
But she tried to hold on to her own humanity, which is amazing to me that she even held on to it at all, considering she had been in the Sea Org since such a young age and had been under LRH and then under Dave her entire existence. That's all she knew, you know.
Right.
That's all she knew. So
yeah.
So that moment was just, it was when I could see that she was my advocate. So, which leads me to the story about IMPR. Like you said, IMPR was one of the probably top 10 hot seats on the base. And I didn't want that post. Dave named me for that post. And the reason he did is because I had done some projects successfully for him, designing uniform programs for St. Hill. I went to St. Hill and he was thrilled with that project. He was really happy with it. And then I went to Copenhagen to AOSH EU, and I did that project. So he saw me as being somebody.
And sorry, just to pause for a moment. And this was, am I correct in remembering that this was actually the start of all the uniforms for all Sea Org members changing from the full-on complete naval
military,
naval military to something at least more palatable to the outside world?
Yes, absolutely. That was it. And that was it was a pivotal point for Sea Org image. And, you know, people might not have liked the work that I did, and that's okay. But he loved it. He was happy with it. Bless you. And he and she were very happy with it. So that's why he named me to be the IMPR, is because I proved myself to be somebody who could receive an order from him and get it done. And not only get it done, but I did it without requiring supervision or prodding, because I loved the work. I loved the designing, because that's what I did professionally before the Sea Org.
Yeah.
So, you know, for me, it was a dream job to be given those kind of projects. And I went off to St. Hill and I set up the production lines for clothing manufacturing in Ireland and Scotland and England, and just transformed the St. Hill basin. He couldn't believe when he came to see the product, what a radical difference it had done. It had made on the staff and their attitude. So he named me to be IMPR, and I fought against taking that post. And it took me months to finally arrive on that post. I did not want the post, but I took it because I didn't know how to get out of it, you know?
Right. Yeah. Because always the implication is, if David Miscavige has named you for a position and you don't accept it, then you have counter intention and you're out ethics, and they're never going to let it go. And listening to you talk, it just reminds me too of how much, like, obviously you had professional background in uniforms. You did a really good job. And nope, you can't stay there. We're going to whisk you on to something else. Whisk you higher, closer to the hot seat. It's so typical of life in the Sea organization. Anyway.
So typical. It's the Peter principle, by the way. Now, you know, you keep getting promoted, not that you have the skills to get promoted to, but there's other reasons why people think you should get promoted. So you do, even though you can't do the job you're being promoted to. But anyway, so
wow, you just gave me a pinged a memory. I think we had to read the Peter Principle when we were at the base.
Really? Oh, wow.
If I'm not, I'm going to make a note of that, because, you know, it was during the years that I was honestly so exhausted, but I've heard the Peter Principle before, and I'm 95% sure that it was at that property, which is just makes it even more insane and ironic.
Wow. Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So I'm on this IMPR post, and of course, this post is a cyclone of trauma. And of course, Ediant is the direct senior to the IMPR post. So Guillaume was my direct senior, but it was Dave who ran me.
Right.
So Dave, here he is, COB RTC. He's running me, issuing orders like constantly, bypassing Guillaume, obsessively bypassing. And long story short, okay, so I'm on this post, and of course we're doing all the int events, and we're supposed to write all the scripts for all the speeches by the execs. And of course, Dave was never happy with what we wrote. So we were all pummeled for that, of course. And then in comes Danny Sherman. So I got to be friends with Danny Sherman because Danny Sherman was now doing my job, getting all the scripts written. And so he had an office, which I would go to help him get research that he requested for the script writing. So Danny and I got to be friends, and Shelley contacted me to do a special gift for Danny Sherman. And that was because Danny Sherman was doing everybody's job at Exec Strata of writing scripts. I was to create a wardrobe for him because they were going to have him be a guest speaker at the next Maiden Voyage event. So first of all, they made Exec Strata buy him a car out of their FP, out of their weekly, whatever. And then Exec Strata had to pay for a wardrobe. So they had to allocate $5,000 for wardrobe. So I worked out a look for Danny. He said he didn't know what he liked, but I could tell what he liked. He liked 1940s two-tone shoes and big shoulders, and he was of that 1940s era. That's what he liked.
Yeah.
So I created a wardrobe for him and brought all these pieces back: shirts, ties, suits, shoes. And he loved these clothes. Well, evidently he raved about it to Shelley and to Dave. And so that was a huge feather in my cap for appeasing Dave to take care of them.
Yeah.
But Shelley would reach out to me to do things like this all the time.
Yeah. And what was the car, by the way, out of curiosity?
I think it was a Mini Cooper. No, it might have been a Mini Cooper. It was some kind of a sports car.
But it was for him personally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Okay, sorry, go ahead. I know it's just from the inurement, like, these are tax exempt dollars and we're buying this guy a car. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
That's your taxpayer dollars, everybody listening, that went to buy Dan Sherman a Mini Cooper.
And a wardrobe.
And a wardrobe.
And a wardrobe to wear on the maiden voyage.
Yeah.
So I'm going to cut to the chase. Working as IMPR, okay, I realized it was while I was IMPR. I already knew that Dave is an SP, but somehow that just everybody tolerated him and his behavior. But it was while I was in the IMPR that I was convinced that Scientology didn't work. And I was really convinced of it largely because of the way Dave treated Guillaume and the executives. He was constantly telling them that they didn't know how to do their jobs and that they weren't making sure that Scientology was working, and they couldn't write programs, they couldn't do evals. And I'm like, wow, everybody's a failure. Nobody can get anything done except Dave, who constantly went around saying, I'm doing everybody else's job, but that's the sign of an SP, is that everybody around an SP is, not doing well, they're failing, they're sick, and everything else. Anyway, at the end of one particular week, we all had an RTC ethics officer would come into Del Sol and do a meter check.
Yep.
So I went to get my meter check, and I said, I held the cans, and he looked up at me, and he said, did you want to say something? I said, I don't want my post. He said, what? I said, I don't want the post of IMPR. I want off of my post. I don't want my post.
Wow, that was a ballsy move, Karen.
I had it. What did I have to lose? I was utterly miserable. I felt I was failing constantly. Every day I felt I was failing. And it made no sense because I was able to be a very successful Sea Org member, but not on that post. And nobody else in Del Sol was successful either, according to Dave. Everybody in Exec Strata was a complete and total failure. And CMO was ineffective at doing anything about it. So, the whole thing was like a big zero. And I'm like, how could I do public relations for international management when international management doesn't know how to do their job?
Yep.
So it was an absolute dead end for me. So, hey, I told the truth. I don't want my post. Well, in about 30 minutes later, there were 2 RTC MAAs or security guys, whatever, came and escorted me out of my office and walked me to, do you remember the drainage canal that we were building? This would have been in the mid to late 90s.
Oh, yeah. Yes, the levee.
Okay, the levee?
Yep.
Yeah, I thought of it as a drainage canal, but everybody, what had been done is estates had been piling boulders and rocks up against the slope to help prevent mudslide, because remember the big mudslide from earlier.
Yes.
From a couple years prior. So there I was in my navy blue wool pants, my long sleeve blue shirt with my black tie and my black leather uniform shoes, and they bring me out to the levee. Well, who else is out there but Fred Swartz, who had just gotten removed as gross income executive, and Fran Harris, who had just gotten removed as books executive. And she had polio. She was out there limping along. And all 3 of us were loading rocks into baskets and putting the baskets against the slope. And it had to be, somewhere between the 90s to 100 degrees.
Right.
And I worked out there for almost 2 weeks, putting rocks into baskets.
Wow.
And talk about slave labor.
Right.
But I'll tell you what, Claire, I was happier putting rocks into baskets than I had been for months as the IMPR.
Yeah, I believe that completely.
Because I was out of the madness of Del Sol.
Yep.
And I was out from under Dave's lunacy. So, to cut to the chase, so I worked my way up the conditions. And I'm on my liability condition. And I went over to CMU because they used to produce the International Scientology News magazine that the IMPR office was responsible for.
Yeah.
So
CMU being marketing for all
Central,
of Scientology.
Central marketing. Yes. And at the time, I can't think of who was the head of it. It might have been Jeff Hawkins, Caroline Mustard. I can't remember. But I was over in the CMU and helping on research for some of the articles that some of the people were writing. And while I was on the computer, remember they were called Mercuries?
Yes.
At the time, we would send a Merc message.
Yep.
At the time, I decided I was going to reach out to COB Assistant for my liability formula to ask her if there was anything I could do to help her as one of my steps on my liability. So I merked her directly, and I said, "Dear sir, I'm over at CMU. I'm working on my liability formula. I'm working on some ISN articles, but I wanted to check with you to see if there is anything I could do to help you as part of my liability formula." I got a message back from her in probably less than 3 minutes.
Wow.
While I was sitting there.
Wow.
And she said, and this is in my book, and Shelley said, "Yes, get on a plane and come to the Flag Land Base. We are doing a big project here to reverse public opinion about Scientology. And we want you to come down here and we want you to redesign the entire Flag Land Base uniforms. And she said, there's no time for a design submission. You don't have to get something approved before you come. Just get on a plane and get here.
Wow.
So I was like, whoa. I went from feeling like a piece of shit on the bottom of people's shoes to all of a sudden, COB's office needs me, wants me at Flag.
Yep.
So I printed off the message and I took it to RTC, I guess because they had been monitoring my ethics program or whatever. And I took it to Exextrata where I'd last been posted. I mean, I didn't have a post right now. I was floating.
Right.
So I printed off this message and I said, COB Assistant wants me to come to Flag right now. And so I need a plane ticket and I need to get approval to go. Well, I didn't need anybody's approval. That was the approval.
Yeah.
So they bought me, I went home and packed a suitcase and they got me a plane ticket and they took me to the airport.
Wow.
And there I flew off to Flag. So
wow, that's crazy. So let me ask you, we're about at an hour. Should we plan on a part 2?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Why
that's
don't
awesome.
I'll wrap up this part of the story real quick.
Perfect.
And then we can do more. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And because I'm excited too to get to your questions and all that. I just, as I mentioned at the beginning, I just wanted to keep track of time. But yes, let's wrap this one up.
Okay.
You have amazing stories, Karen. Thank you for sharing.
Oh my goodness. So thank you. I get to Flag, and the first place Shelley told me to go to the CMOCW building. I forgot what that was called.
The WB, I think
the
it was
WB.
called. Yeah.
And she said, go to CMOCW and see the CO, who at the time was Jenny DeVocht.
Yes.
And I checked in with Jenny, and the LRH PPRO, who I think her name was Lisa or Lana or something like that at the time, she said, the CO will be with you in a minute, and I will too. Meanwhile, I've got to put you in an office because that's what COB Assistant said. Put Karen in an office in the WB. And she said, put her in an office down the hall. COB Assistant and COB were at one end of the hall, and there was this long hall, and they put me in an office at the end. Okay. So that's where they put me, with a table, my drawing table and everything. Long story short, I just want to wrap up with this. The LRHP Pro, I think her name was Lana, she said, I've got to go because there's this major Dev T cycle. Some chick died in the Fort Harrison, and I have to go handle it. I said, wow. Somebody died in the FH? She said, somebody died in, I forgot what they call them, the cabanas in the back. Some chick died in a cabana. That was Lisa McPherson. Yeah. And I didn't know anything about it. Nobody at INT had heard about it. And I don't know how, I think it had just happened within a few days prior. And then I saw what was going on. COB Assistant flew me out there. She said, we need to do a major reversal of public opinion of the Flag Land Base in Clearwater, and we need to get rid of the military image. And so that became my role. And that became my job for like the next, however long I was there, 6 or 7 months, and redid the whole Flag Land Base. And after that, I had like a free ticket. I mean, it was like, after doing a successful project for them, and when I went back to INT, they then promoted me, and then I ended up in the INT landlord's office as an international uniform officer. And the rest is history. Then I redid basically the image of the Sea Org, but Shelley, as my advocate, is the one who was responsible for that pivot turnaround in my demise. And so I could only attribute it to her. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, well, that's crazy. Well, so this is a good point to end off part 1 with you.
I think so. I've got other stories, but certainly we could tell them at another time. And
yes,
I thought it would be really cool to talk about how you and I met, and also, if you'd allow me, is to ask you questions, because there are certain things I would love to know what you think, because I've got specific questions I wanted to ask you. So I kind of hope we can do that in another conversation.
Let's absolutely do that. I'm very excited, and I don't want you to cut short on your story. So we'll just make this a 2-parter. And for today, thank you so much again for sharing your insights and your stories. And we'll get to part 2 and all of your questions as well. And we'll go from there.
And I just want to put up my book for anyone who would like to read more about those stories. It's in Escaping Scientology on Amazon.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Claire, for taking the time to talk with me. I really am glad we did this.
Me too. And absolutely my pleasure. And we will talk again soon.
Okay. Sounds great.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.